Instead of revenge, he chose something that could change thousands of lives. A quiet single dad walks into the luxury restaurant and gets pushed into the corner like he doesn't belong. But just minutes later, a female billionaire stands up, walks over to his table, and asks a question that silences the entire room. What no one realizes is that the man they overlooked carries a past powerful enough to change everything, even her life. The door opened with a soft hush, letting in a slice of cold Manhattan air before sealing the warmth back inside. The steakhouse glowed in amber light, polished wood, low chandeliers, the steady rhythm of silverware tapping against porcelain. It was the kind of place where people spoke in quiet confidence and never checked prices on the menu. James Carter stepped in wearing a faded charcoal jacket that had seen better winters. A few droplets of melted sleet clung to the shoulders, catching the light before disappearing into the worn fabric. He paused just inside the entrance, not out of hesitation, but as if he were letting his eyes adjust, not to the light, but to the space itself. A hostess looked up from behind the podium. Her smile arrived a second too late. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice polite but measured. James nodded once. "Table for one." Her eyes moved over him, quick, practiced, shoes scuffed, jacket old, hands rough. Not dangerous, not loud, just out of place. "Of course," she said, though it didn't sound like she meant it. She picked up a menu and stepped around the podium. Right this way. They passed tables filled with couples in pressed suits and silk dresses. Glasses of red wine caught the light. Laughter stayed low, controlled. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. As James walked behind her, he felt it. The shift in the room. Not silence. Not even obvious ascension, just that subtle tightening. The kind that comes when something doesn't quite belong, but hasn't been asked to leave yet. A man at a corner table leaned slightly toward his companion, murmuring something behind his hand. A woman glanced up, eyes flicking down to James's jacket before returning to her plate. A server carrying a tray adjusted his path, just enough to avoid brushing too close. The hostess didn't stop near the windows, where the skyline stretched wide and glowing. She didn't stop near the center, where the energy of the room pooled like warmth. Instead, she kept walking, past the bar, past the polished tables, until the scent of sizzling meat grew stronger and the hum of the kitchen pressed closer. "There we are," she said, gesturing toward a small two-top table tucked near a half wall that separated the dining room from the service area. It wasn't a bad table. It was just not a table anyone chose. James looked at it, then at her. Just for a second. Not challenging, not questioning, just acknowledging. "That's fine," he said. She placed the menu down. "Your server will be right with you." James pulled out the chair and sat, moving with a kind of quiet precision that didn't match the rest of him. His posture was straight, shoulders relaxed but steady, like someone used to carrying more weight than showed. The sounds of the kitchen filtered through. Orders called out, metal on metal, the sharp hiss of something hitting heat. It was louder here, less refined, closer to real life. He picked up the menu, eyes scanning it without expression. A ribeye here cost more than what he made in a day. He didn't react, didn't sigh, didn't frown, just turned the page. A server approached, a young man with slicked back hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Evening," he said. "Can I start you with something to drink?" "Water's fine," James replied. "Spark or still, tap's good." The server hesitated, just for a beat, then nodded. "Sure thing." He walked off, and James placed the menu back down on the table. His fingers rested lightly on the edge, calloused knuckles pale against the white linen. At the next table over, a man in a navy suit leaned back in his chair, speaking a little louder than necessary. "I mean, some places just don't filter anymore," he said, glancing sideways without fully turning his head. "You pay for a certain atmosphere." His companion chuckled softly. "You're terrible." James didn't look up, didn't move, The words landed, but they didn't stick. Or maybe they did, just not in a way that showed. The server returned with a glass of water, setting it down carefully. "Ready to order?" he asked. James picked up the menu again, though he already knew. "I'll have the grilled chicken," he said. "No sides." The server blinked. "Just the chicken? That's right." "All right," he scribbled quickly. "That'll be out shortly." As he walked away, he muttered something under his breath. Not loud enough to catch. Not meant to be. James reached for the glass, taking a slow sip. The water was cold, clean. He set it back down with care, aligning it with the edge of the table. Around him, the night carried on. Glasses clinked. A birthday was quietly celebrated at a table near the window. Someone laughed too loudly, then apologized. Life moved. Smooth. Effortless. James sat in the space between it all, like a shadow that hadn't been invited but hadn't been pushed out either. Near the far side of the room, a woman lowered her wine glass and looked up. Elizabeth Whitmore. Whitmore had been halfway through a conversation she wasn't really listening to when she noticed him. Not because he was loud, not because he demanded attention, but because he didn't. In a room full of people trying to be seen, he was the only one who wasn't. Her gaze lingered. There was something about the way he sat. Still. Grounded. Like he was carrying a different kind of weight than anyone else in the room. She watched as a busboy passed his table without making eye contact. Watched as the server took his order with just a hint of impatience. Watched as no one chose to see him. Elizabeth set her glass down slowly. "Excuse me," she said, though no one at her table had asked a question. Her attention had already shifted. Across the room, James lifted his eyes for just a moment. Not toward her. Just up, like he was listening for something no one else could hear. Then he looked back down at the table, hands resting quietly, waiting for a meal that hadn't come yet. And somehow, in a room filled with everything money could buy, he looked like the only man who had ever earned his place anywhere. The question hung in the air, unspoken, unseen. Why would someone like him sit here and accept being treated like he didn't belong? And more importantly, kind of life teaches a man to stay silent when the world tells him to leave? The answer didn't live in the restaurant. It lived miles away, across the East River, past the clean glass towers and quiet doormen, tucked into a part of the Bronx where the streetlights flickered and the sidewalks cracked beneath too many winters. James Carter pushed open the door to his building just after midnight. The hallway smelled faintly of bleach and something older that never quite left. Damp wood, old pipes, time itself settling into the walls. The overhead light buzzed, flickering once before holding steady. Someone upstairs was arguing. A TV played too loud through thin drywall. Life, unpolished and loud, moved on without ceremony. James didn't react. He climbed the stairs slowly, one hand brushing the railing, boots heavy but controlled. He moved like someone who measured his steps, not because he had to, but because he always had. On the third floor, he stopped outside a chipped blue door. For a moment, he just stood there. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small key, and turned it gently, careful not to make noise. Inside, the apartment was quiet. A soft lamp glowed in the corner of the living room, casting warm light across worn furniture and a stack of books that leaned against the wall like they were holding each other up. The air carried the faint scent of peanut butter and something sweet. On the couch, curled beneath a thin blanket, was Maya. Her small frame rose and fell with steady breaths, one arm wrapped around a stuffed rabbit that had lost most of its fur. Her homework was spread across the coffee table, math problems half finished, pencil still resting where her hand had given up. James closed the door behind him without a sound. He crossed the room, kneeling beside the couch. For a moment, he just watched her. The tension in his shoulders eased, inch by inch, like something inside him finally had permission to rest. "Hey, baby girl," he whispered. Maya stirred, eyes fluttering open. "Daddy, I'm home." She pushed herself up, blanket slipping down her shoulders. "You ate?" James smiled. "Yeah," he said softly. "Best meal I've had in a while." It wasn't a lie he liked telling, but it was one he had learned to tell well. Maya studied his face like she always did. Kids had a way of looking past words. "Good," she said finally, satisfied enough. Then she reached beside her and held something out. A small paper plate, on it a single slice of bread with peanut butter, cut unevenly. "I saved you some," she said, "just in case." James took it like it was something fragile. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, already settling back down, her head finding the pillow again. Within seconds, her breathing slowed, drifting back into sleep like she trusted the world to hold for just a little longer. James stayed there a moment longer. Then he stood, moving quietly to the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, staring at the sandwich in his hand. Outside, a siren passed in the distance. Inside, the apartment held its breath. He took a bite. It wasn't much, but it was enough. On the wall near the kitchen doorway, a frame hung slightly crooked. James walked over and adjusted it, his fingers lingering on the edge. Inside the frame was a photograph, faded at the corners, worn from time. A younger version of him stood in uniform, shoulders squared, eyes sharp. Beside him, a woman smiled, her hand resting lightly against his chest, and between them, a much smaller version of Maya, laughing at something outside the frame. James exhaled slowly. Next to it, mounted carefully, was something else, a medal, polished once, now dulled by dust. He didn't clean it anymore. Didn't look at it much either. Not because it didn't matter, because it mattered too much. The next morning came early. The city never really slept, but mornings in the Bronx had their own rhythm. Garbage trucks growled down the street. A man shouted something about fresh coffee from a cart on the corner. Somewhere, music leaked out of an open window. James stood at the sink, rinsing out a chipped mug. Maya sat at the small table, swinging her legs as she struggled with a math problem. "Carry the one," she muttered under her breath. "Why do I always forget that part?" James dried his hands and walked over. "Let me see." She slid the paper toward him. He looked at it for a second, then picked up the pencil. "You're not forgetting," he said. "You're rushing." She frowned. "I'm not rushing." "You want to be done," he said gently. "That's different." He showed her step by step, slow, steady. Maya watched, then nodded. She said, "That's easy." James smiled. "Most things are," he said, "if you take your time." She looked up at him. "Did you take your time yesterday?" The question hung there. James met her eyes, then looked away for just a second. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I did." Maya accepted that. Kids did sometimes. They chose what to believe because they needed to. "Okay," she said, going back to her paper. James reached for his jacket, the same one from the night before. He slipped it on, adjusting the collar without thinking. "You ready?" he asked. "Ready." They stepped out into the hallway together. As they walked down the stairs, Maya slipped her hand into his. James didn't react, but he didn't pull away either. Later that day, across the city, in a building made of glass and quiet power, Elizabeth Whitmore stood at a window overlooking Manhattan. The skyline stretched endlessly, a monument to everything money could build. Behind her, voices filled a conference room. Numbers, projections, decisions that moved millions of dollars with a sentence. She wasn't listening. Her mind was somewhere else. Back in a restaurant. At a table near the kitchen, at a man who didn't belong, and somehow belonged more than anyone else in the room. She picked up her phone, hesitated, then set it back down. "What is it?" one of her executives asked. Elizabeth turned slowly. "Nothing," she said. But it wasn't nothing, because for the first time in a long time, she couldn't stop thinking about someone the world had already decided didn't matter. She had a feeling that decision was about to be proven wrong. The restaurant had long since emptied, but the memory of it stayed with her. Elizabeth Whitmore stood in her office long after everyone else had left. The city stretched beneath her like a living map of power and distance. Lights flickered on in buildings across Manhattan, one by one, like signals she had learned to read years ago. Opportunity, control, influence. But tonight, those lights felt different, because somewhere beyond them, a man sat in a place the world barely noticed and carried himself like none of it mattered. She turned from the window and walked back to her desk, fingers brushing the edge of a leather folder without opening it. Instead, she reached for her phone again, paused, then set it down. She didn't know his name. That bothered her more than it should have. The next evening, the city moved fast again. Taxis honked in tight streets. Steam rose from manholes. Neon lights flickered alive as the sky darkened, painting everything in soft reds and blues that blurred into something almost unreal. Inside the same steakhouse, the rhythm hadn't changed, but something else had. James Carter stepped through the door again. Same jacket, same quiet presence, same calm that didn't ask for permission. The hostess looked up, and this time her reaction came quicker. Recognition, not warmth, not welcome, just recognition. "You again?" she said, before catching herself. "I mean, good evening." James nodded. "Evening." She hesitated, glancing briefly toward the manager across the room. A silent exchange passed between them, a question without words. Then she picked up a menu. Right this way. They walked the same path as the night before, past the same tables, past the same glances, past the same unspoken judgments that didn't need to change to be understood. And once again, she stopped at the same table near the kitchen. "Here you go." James looked at the chair, then sat. No complaint, no question, just acceptance. But not the kind that came from weakness, the kind that came from knowing exactly what mattered and what didn't. A few tables away, a man in a gray suit leaned toward his date. "Didn't we see him last night?" he murmured. She followed his gaze. "I think so." "Strange," he said. "Place like this?" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. James picked up the menu again, though it hadn't changed. Same prices. Same choices. Same decision. The server approached, different from the night before, older, slower in his movements, but sharper in his eyes. "Good evening," he said. "What can I get for you?" James closed the menu. Same as yesterday. Grilled chicken, no sides. The server studied him for a moment, then nodded, coming right up, no hesitation, no judgment, just service. James gave a small nod back. Sometimes respect didn't come loud. Sometimes it came quiet, almost invisible. But it was there. At the far end of the room, Elizabeth had arrived earlier than usual. She hadn't planned to come back. At least that's what she told herself. But when she walked in and saw him sitting there again, same table, same posture, same quiet, something in her stilled. He wasn't waiting for anything, not attention, not approval, just a meal. She watched as he took a sip of water, movements measured, steady, not rushed, not distracted, like the rest of the world didn't exist unless it needed to. "Ms. Whitmore?" Her assistant's voice broke through. "Yes, your guests are ready." Elizabeth glanced toward the private dining room, then back at James. For a moment, the decision felt simple. Then it didn't. "I'll be there in a minute," she said. Her assistant hesitated. They've been waiting. They can wait a little longer. The tone was soft, but final. James didn't notice her watching. Or if he did, he didn't show it. A busboy passed by carrying a tray of plates stacked too high. One slipped. It hit the floor with a sharp crack. The sound cut through the room, drawing eyes from every direction. The boy froze, maybe 17, maybe younger. His face drained of color as he looked down at the broken plate. "I'm sorry," he stammered. "I didn't mean—" The manager was already moving toward him, expression tight. "Do you have any idea how much that costs?" he snapped, voice low but sharp enough to carry. "I'll pay for it," the boy said quickly, panic rising. With what?" the manager cut in. "You can barely handle a tray." "It's okay." The voice didn't come from across the room. It came from right beside them. James had already stood. He stepped forward, calm as ever, and crouched down to help gather the broken pieces. "Careful," he said quietly to the boy. "Edges are sharp." The boy stared at him, stunned. "You don't have to, I know," James said. He picked up the largest piece and set it on the tray, moving with steady hands that didn't shake. The manager watched, irritation flickering into something else. Confusion, maybe. "This isn't your concern," he said. James didn't look up. Accidents happen. The room had gone quiet again, not the same quiet as before. This one held weight, because now everyone was watching. And this time, they were seeing something they hadn't expected. The boy swallowed hard. "Thank you," he whispered. James gave a small nod, then stood, brushing his hands together like it was nothing, like helping someone didn't need to be noticed to matter. Across the room, Elizabeth exhaled slowly. There it was, not just who he was when no one looked, but who he was when everyone did. She pushed her chair back. Her assistant stepped forward again. "Ms. Whitmore, your meeting, reschedule it." "Excuse me?" "Reschedule it," she repeated. "Tomorrow morning." The assistant blinked. "But the investors will still be investors tomorrow." She didn't wait for another response. Because the decision had already been made. James returned to his table, sat down, picked up his glass like nothing had happened, like it wasn't something worth holding on to. But the room hadn't gone back to normal. It couldn't, because something had shifted, small but real. And for the first time since he walked in, James Carter didn't feel invisible. He just didn't know it yet. Elizabeth took a step toward him, then another. The distance between them wasn't far, but it carried something heavier than space. Because once she crossed it, nothing about this night would stay the same. And this time, she wasn't going to just watch. The distance between them was no more than 20 feet. But every step Elizabeth Whitmore took across that polished floor felt like it echoed louder than it should. Heads turned. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But enough. People noticed when someone like her moved with purpose. The kind of woman whose presence usually pulled attention without effort was now giving it, freely, deliberately, to someone no one else had chosen to see. James didn't look up at first. He had just taken another sip of water, setting the glass down with the same quiet precision as before. His plate hadn't arrived yet. The chair across from him remained empty, untouched, like it had been waiting for someone who never came. Elizabeth stopped beside his table. For a moment, she said nothing. Up close, he looked even more still, not frozen, not tense, just grounded, like a man who had already stood through storms most people never saw coming. "Excuse me," her voice was calm, clear, the kind that didn't need to be raised to be heard. James looked up. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. Not recognition, not yet, but awareness, a quiet acknowledgement that neither of them was what the other expected. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The formality wasn't submissive. It was measured. Respect given because it cost him nothing to give it. Elizabeth held his gaze. "May I sit with you?" The question didn't belong in that room. It didn't belong between them, and yet it landed like it had been waiting to be asked. For a second, nothing moved. Not the servers, not the guests, not even the music that seemed to fade into the background. Then the room caught up. A fork paused mid-air at a nearby table. A man near the bar turned fully in his seat. Someone whispered, too loud to be subtle. "Is she serious?" James didn't answer right away. He glanced briefly at the empty chair across from him, then back at her. "You probably don't want to do that," he said quietly. Elizabeth tilted her head. "Why not?" He didn't smile. "Because they won't like it." He didn't gesture. Didn't need to. The room had already made its position clear. Elizabeth followed his gaze, not to anyone specific, but to the collective weight of the place itself. Then she looked back at him. "I didn't ask them." There was no defiance in her voice, just fact. James studied her for a moment longer, trying to understand, not who she was, but why. People didn't cross lines like this without a reason, and whatever her reason was, it didn't show on the surface. "You sure about that?" he asked. Elizabeth gave the smallest nod. "I am." Another pause. Then James reached out and gently pulled the empty chair back. "If you're sure," he said. That was all. No ceremony, no performance, just permission. Elizabeth sat, and the room changed. The manager noticed first. He had been watching from the edge of the floor, arms crossed, expression tight, with something he couldn't quite hide. He moved quickly now, weaving between tables, his smile already prepared. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, tone polished, "we've prepared your private table. If you'd like—" "I'm fine here," she said, not looking at him. The manager blinked. "Of course, but this section is occupied?" She finished for him, finally turning her eyes up. There was no anger there, but there was something stronger. Clarity, the kind that didn't invite negotiation. The manager hesitated. "We just want to ensure your experience. My experience is exactly where I want it to be." Silence stretched for half a second too long. Then the manager forced a smile. "Very well," he stepped back, but he didn't leave far. At another table, the man in the navy suit leaned forward again, voice low but sharp. "This is unbelievable." His companion shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe she knows him. From where?" he scoffed. "A delivery route?" A few people chuckled. Not loudly, but enough. James heard it. Of course he did. He always did. But he didn't react. Instead, he looked at Elizabeth. "You don't have to prove anything," he said. "Not to them." Elizabeth folded her hands lightly on the table. "I'm not trying to prove anything." "Then why are you here?" It wasn't confrontational. It was honest. She considered the question, then answered just as simply, "Because you helped that kid." James glanced toward the kitchen, where the busboy had disappeared. "That's not a reason," he said. "It is to me." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "That happens all the time," he said. "People help each other." Elizabeth shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "They don't." That landed, not heavy, but true. James didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked down at the table again, fingers resting near the edge of his glass. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked. Elizabeth almost smiled. "Is it that obvious? You noticed something no one else did. That's because I was looking." James let that sit, then nodded once. "Most people aren't," he said. Their food arrived, a single plate for James, a server hovering awkwardly beside Elizabeth. "Would you like to order, ma'am?" he asked. Elizabeth didn't even glance at the menu. "I'll have the same thing he's having." The server hesitated. "The grilled chicken? Yes. No sides? Yes." Another pause. "Of course." He walked away quickly, like staying any longer might make things more complicated than they already were. For a while, they sat in a kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, not empty, just unforced. Around them, the restaurant tried to return to normal. Conversations picked back up, glasses clinked again. But something had shifted, something subtle that no one could quite ignore, because now, every glance toward that table carried a question. Why him? And maybe, what are we missing? James picked up his fork. You do this often? He asked. Sit where I'm not supposed to? Elizabeth replied. Something like that. She shook her head. No, then tonight must be special. Maybe it is. He looked at her again, longer this time, not suspicious, just curious. You don't even know me, he said. Elizabeth met his eyes without hesitation. I know enough. You don't know anything, he said, but there was no edge to it. She leaned forward slightly. I know you didn't have to help that kid, she said. I know no one else did, and I know you didn't do it for attention. James looked away first. That doesn't make me special. No, she said softly. It makes you rare. Across the room, the tension hadn't disappeared. It had just changed shape, because now it wasn't about a man who didn't belong. It was about a man someone important had chosen to sit with. And that was something people understood, even if they didn't like it. James set his fork down. Let me ask you something, he said. Okay, if I wasn't sitting here, he said, would you still be watching? Elizabeth didn't answer right away, because the truth mattered, and she wasn't used to saying it out loud. No, she admitted. James nodded. Then maybe this isn't about me. Elizabeth held his gaze. Maybe it is now. The words hung there, quiet, uncertain, but real. And somewhere deep beneath the noise of the restaurant, beneath the judgment and the whispers and the quiet tension, something had already started to change. James just didn't know how much yet, and neither did she, but they were about to find out. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The restaurant breathed around them again. Low conversations, the soft scrape of chairs, the distant hum of the kitchen. But it felt different now. Quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. James picked up his fork again, cutting into the grilled chicken with slow, deliberate movements. Across from him, Elizabeth mirrored the stillness, her hands resting lightly on the table, her posture relaxed but attentive. She wasn't used to this. Not the silence, not the lack of expectation. Every conversation in her world had a purpose. Negotiation, persuasion, control. Words were tools, sharpened and used carefully. But here, none of that applied. So, she said finally, her voice softer than before, what do you do? James didn't look up right away. Whatever needs doing, he replied. That's not an answer. It's the truth. She studied him. You have more than one job? He gave a small shrug. Depends on the week. What about today? Today. He paused, thinking. Delivered groceries this morning. Fixed a leaking pipe for a neighbor in the afternoon. Came here tonight. Elizabeth leaned back slightly, absorbing that. You don't have a steady job? James shook his head once. Used to. What happened? He didn't answer immediately. The question wasn't offensive, it wasn't rude, but it wasn't simple either. Life, he said eventually. Elizabeth didn't press. She had learned long ago that people revealed more when you didn't force them to. Instead, she reached for her water, taking a small sip. You have a family? She asked. That made him look up. Yeah, he said. A daughter. A flicker of something crossed his face then. Subtle. Quick, but real. How old? 8. Her name, Maya. Elizabeth smiled faintly. That's a beautiful name. James nodded once. She is. There was no hesitation in that answer. No doubt. Just certainty. At the edge of the room, the manager hadn't stopped watching. He leaned toward one of the senior servers, voice low. Keep an eye on that table, he said. The server followed his gaze. You want me to move her? Not yet, the manager muttered. But if this turns into a problem... He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Back at the table, Elizabeth rested her chin lightly against her hand. And her mom? She asked. The question came gently, but it still landed. James's fork paused mid-air for just a second, then he set it down. She passed, he said. Elizabeth straightened slightly. I'm sorry, James nodded. That was all. No story, no explanation. Just the weight of it, sitting there between them. Do you mind if I ask? Elizabeth began, then stopped herself. James gave a small shake of his head. You can ask, he said. Doesn't mean I'll answer. That earned the faintest hint of a smile from her. Fair enough, she hesitated anyway, then chose a different path. What's she like? She asked instead. This time James didn't hesitate. She's smart, he said. Too smart sometimes. Asks questions I don't always have answers to. Elizabeth nodded. That sounds familiar. She thinks she knows everything. Most kids do. She might be right, he added. That made Elizabeth laugh. Soft. Genuine. The sound didn't fit the room. It didn't fit her usual world either. But it fit their moment. Their food sat half-finished now. Neither of them seemed in a hurry, which, in a place like this, was unusual. Meals were meant to be enjoyed, but efficiently, elegantly, within a rhythm that didn't disrupt the flow of the room. But this table had already disrupted everything. A man approached from the side, mid-50s, expensive watch, the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. Elizabeth, he said, stopping just short of the table. She looked up. Richard, she replied. I was wondering where you disappeared to, he said, glancing briefly at James before returning his attention to her. The meeting. I rescheduled it, she said. He frowned. You rescheduled a 7-figure discussion. For this? His eyes flicked toward James again. This time the judgment wasn't subtle. James didn't react, didn't look at him, didn't give him anything. Elizabeth's expression didn't change either. Yes, she said calmly. Richard let out a short breath. You're serious, I am. He studied her for a moment longer, then leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. You don't know who you're sitting with. Elizabeth's gaze didn't waver. I know exactly who I'm sitting with, she said. Richard straightened, clearly unconvinced. Just be careful, he said. Not everyone is what they seem. James finally looked up then, not at Richard, at Elizabeth. There was no challenge in his expression, no defensiveness, just quiet understanding, like he had heard that sentence before, too many times. Richard walked away, shaking his head. The tension lingered behind him. Elizabeth exhaled slowly. Sorry about that, she said. James shrugged. You don't have to apologize for other people. That doesn't mean I agree with them. I didn't say you did. Another pause. Then James picked up his fork again, finishing the last bite on his plate. Why did you really come over here? He asked. Elizabeth met his eyes. I told you. No, he said. You told me what I did. She held his gaze. And that wasn't enough? It was a reason, he said. Not the reason. The distinction hung there. Clear. Unavoidable. Elizabeth looked down at the table for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. I spend most of my life around people who take, she said. They take credit. They take advantage. They take whatever they can. She looked back up. You didn't. James didn't respond. You didn't ask for anything, she continued. You didn't even expect a thank you. That's not how it works, he said. For most people, it is. He shook his head slightly. Then most people got it wrong. The words settled between them, simple but heavier than anything else that had been said. At the far end of the room, the manager started moving again, this time with more purpose, because something about this situation had crossed a line he couldn't ignore, and he was about to do something about it. Back at the table, James reached for his wallet. Elizabeth noticed. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Paying for my meal." She frowned slightly. "You don't have to, I do," he said, already placing cash on the table. "That's how this works." Elizabeth watched him for a moment, then nodded. All right, but something in her expression shifted, because she understood now. This wasn't about money, it never had been. James stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just finished. "It was nice talking to you," he said. Elizabeth rose with him. She said. He paused. She hesitated, just for a second, then asked the question that had been building all night. "What's your name?" James looked at her. Really looked this time, as if deciding whether it mattered. Then he answered. "James," he said. "James Carter." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "I'm Elizabeth," I figured. A faint smile touched her lips. "Of course you did." He turned to leave, and for a moment, it looked like that was it. Just another night. Just another encounter that would fade into memory. But Elizabeth knew better, because something about this man, something about the way he carried himself, the way he moved through a world that refused to see him, wasn't going to stay small. And as James Carter walked toward the door, she realized something else. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something neither of them could control, and whatever came next was going to change everything. The door closed behind James with a soft click. For a second, the restaurant held its breath. Then the noise returned. Glasses clinked. Conversations resumed. Laughter tried to stitch the room back together like nothing had happened, but something had. Everyone felt it. They just didn't know what to call it. Outside, the air was colder, the kind of cold that didn't bite right away but settled into your bones slowly, like it had time. James stepped onto the sidewalk, pulling his jacket tighter around him. The city stretched out in front of him, horns in the distance, headlights sliding past like restless thoughts, steam rising from the pavement in thin white ribbons. He didn't rush. He never did. He walked down the block with steady steps, hands in his pockets, head slightly lowered, not in defeat, but in focus. Behind him, through the tall glass windows, the restaurant still glowed, warm, golden, separate. He didn't look back. Inside, Elizabeth hadn't moved. She stood beside the empty chair, her fingers resting lightly on the back of it, as if the moment hadn't fully ended yet. "Miss Whitmore?" The manager's voice came again, more cautious now. She didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the door, on the space where James had been. "You should return to your table," the manager added carefully. "Your guests, they can wait." The words came out quieter this time, but heavier. The manager shifted his weight. "With all due respect, ma'am, this situation, it's not appropriate." Elizabeth turned slowly. "What part of it?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. He opened his mouth, then hesitated. "This establishment maintains a certain standard," he said finally. "We have to consider the comfort of all our guests." Elizabeth studied him. "And you think he made them uncomfortable?" The manager straightened. Some guests expressed concerns. "No," she said softly. "They expressed judgment. That's exactly what it is." Her voice didn't rise, but it cut cleaner than if it had. The manager glanced around, aware now that a few people were watching. "We're just trying to protect the environment," he said. Elizabeth let out a slow breath. "The environment was fine," she replied, "until you decided someone didn't belong in it." Silence, not loud, but undeniable. At a nearby table, the man in the navy suit shifted uncomfortably. "This is getting ridiculous," he muttered. He left. "It's over." Elizabeth heard him. She turned slightly, her gaze landing on him with quiet precision. "Is it?" she asked. He stiffened. "I'm sorry? Is it over?" she repeated. He hesitated. "Well, yes, he's gone." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "Then why are we still talking about him?" That shut him up. Across the room, the busboy from earlier stood frozen near the kitchen entrance. He had watched everything, from the moment the plate fell, to the moment James knelt down beside him, to the moment the man who helped him walked out like it meant nothing. His hands still trembled slightly, not from fear anymore, from something else, something he didn't have a name for yet. Elizabeth turned back toward the door, and this time, she moved, not toward her table, not toward the manager, toward the exit. "Ma'am?" her assistant called, stepping forward quickly. "Where are you going?" Elizabeth didn't slow down. "Out. Your meeting. Tomorrow. But tomorrow," she repeated. And that was the end of it. Outside, the night felt wider, colder, real. Elizabeth stepped onto the sidewalk, the hum of the city wrapping around her instantly. For a moment, she just stood there, looking. James was already halfway down the block. A quiet figure moving through a city that barely noticed him. She could let him go. That would be the easier choice, the expected one, the one that kept everything in place. But something inside her resisted, because letting him walk away meant accepting that what happened inside didn't matter, and it did, more than she was ready to admit. "James," she called. Her voice didn't carry far, but it didn't need to. He stopped, not abruptly, just paused, then turned. She walked toward him, heels clicking softly against the pavement. Up close, the city looked different, less polished, more honest. "You forgot something," she said. James frowned slightly. "I paid." "I know." "Then what?" She hesitated. For the first time that night, she didn't have a prepared answer. "I don't think this is where it ends," she said finally. James studied her. "You don't know me," he said. "You're right. Then why are you still here?" The question wasn't defensive. It was tired, like he had asked it before, too many times. Elizabeth took a breath, because people don't walk away from something like that, unless they've been walking away their whole life. The words landed, quiet but direct. James looked at her for a long moment, then glanced down the street, then back at her. "You're reading too much into it," he said. "Am I?" "Yes." A pause. Then he added, softer this time. "It was just dinner." Elizabeth shook her head. "No," she said. "It wasn't." He exhaled slowly, a faint trace of something crossing his face. Weariness, maybe. "You don't have to fix anything," he said. "I'm not trying to fix anything." "Then what are you trying to do?" She met his eyes. Understand. That stopped him. Because most people didn't ask that. They assumed. They labeled. They moved on. But they didn't try to understand. A bus roared past at the end of the block, brakes hissing as it pulled up to the stop. James glanced toward it, then back at her. "I've got somewhere to be," he said. Elizabeth nodded. "I figured." Another pause. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a card. Plain, simple. She held it out. "If you ever want to talk," she said, "or if you need anything." James looked at the card, then at her, then back at the card. He didn't take it right away. "I don't need anything," he said. "I didn't say you did." Another beat. Then slowly he reached out and took it, not because he needed it, but because refusing it felt like closing a door he wasn't sure should be closed yet. He slipped it into his jacket pocket without looking at it. "Good night, Elizabeth," he said. She blinked slightly. "You remembered my name. You said it. Most people don't. I'm not most people. That wasn't arrogance. It was fact." The bus doors opened with a sharp hiss. James stepped back. "Take care," he said. Then he turned and walked toward it. No hesitation, no looking back. The doors closed behind him. And just like that, he was gone. Elizabeth stood there on the sidewalk long after the bus had disappeared into traffic. The city moved around her, unbothered, unchanged. But something inside her had shifted, something small, something quiet, something she couldn't ignore anymore. Because for the first time in a long time, she had met someone who didn't want anything from her. And somehow, that mattered more than anything she had built her life on. Across the city, inside a moving bus lit by flickering overhead lights, James sat near the window. The card rested in his hand now. He hadn't meant to take it out, but he had. He turned it over once, didn't read it, just felt it, then slipped it back into his pocket. Outside, the city blurred past, lights stretching into lines, people moving through their own stories. James leaned his head back against the glass, closed his eyes for a moment, and let the noise fade. He didn't know what that conversation meant, didn't know what would come next, but he knew one thing. For the first time in a long time, someone had looked at him and actually seen him, and that was harder to walk away from than anything else. The bus rattled through the city, its metal frame humming softly as it cut through pockets of traffic and dim intersections. The overhead lights flickered every few seconds, casting uneven shadows across tired faces and empty seats. James sat near the back, one arm resting against the window, his reflection faint in the glass. Outside, Manhattan slowly gave way to darker streets. The bright towers softened into brick buildings. The sidewalks grew quieter. The glow of wealth faded into something more familiar, something raw, unpolished, real. He reached into his pocket again. The card was still there. He pulled it out, turning it between his fingers this time. Clean, white, simple, Elizabeth Whitmore. No title printed beneath it, no company name, just her name. That alone told him everything he needed to know. People like her didn't need to explain who they were. He stared at it for a moment longer, then slipped it back into his pocket. Not throwing it away, not holding on to it either. Just keeping it, like a question he wasn't ready to answer. By the time the bus slowed to his stop, rain had started to fall. Not heavy, just enough to coat the pavement in a thin sheen that reflected streetlights like broken glass. James stepped off, pulling his jacket tighter again. The bus hissed behind him, then rolled forward, disappearing down the block. For a moment, he stood there alone, rain tapping lightly against his shoulders, city noise fading into distance. He exhaled, then started walking. The streets here didn't pretend to be anything they weren't. A liquor store on the corner with flickering neon. A laundromat still open, machines spinning behind fogged-up windows. A group of teenagers huddled under an awning, laughing too loud, trying to stay dry. James passed through it all without drawing attention, but not without noticing. He always noticed. Halfway down the block, he slowed. An older woman stood near the curb, struggling with a grocery cart that had caught on the uneven edge of the sidewalk. One of the wheels had twisted sideways, refusing to move. She tugged at it again. It didn't budge. "Come on now," she muttered under her breath. James didn't hesitate. He stepped off the sidewalk and walked toward her. "Hold on," he said quietly. She looked up, startled at first, then relieved. "Oh, thank you, baby," she said. "This thing's got a mind of its own." James crouched down, examining the wheel. It wasn't broken, just stuck at a bad angle. He adjusted it carefully, steady hands guiding it back into place. "There you go," he said, standing again. The cart rolled smoothly now. The woman smiled. "I appreciate that. Most folks just walk right past." James gave a small nod. "It happens. You stay dry out here," she added, already moving again. "You too." He watched her for a second, then kept walking. Rain picked up slightly as he turned onto his street. The building stood where it always did, unchanged, worn, familiar. He climbed the stairs again, quieter this time, his boots leaving faint, damp prints behind him. Inside the apartment, the lamp was still on. Maya was awake, sitting at the table now, legs tucked under her, a book open in front of her. She looked up the second the door opened. "Daddy!" Her face lit up. That alone was enough to shift something inside him. "Hey," he said softly. "You're late," she said, not accusing, just stating. "Yeah," he replied. "Got caught up in the rain?" "A little." She hopped off the chair and walked over, taking his hand without asking. Her fingers were small, warm. "Did you eat?" she asked. James paused, just for a second, then nodded. "I did." Maya studied his face again, like she always did. Then she smiled. "Good," she said, "because I ate all the snacks." That made him chuckle under his breath. "I figured." She tugged him toward the table. "Come sit. I need help with something." "What is it reading?" "You can read." "I know," she said, "but I like it when you do it." James sat down. She climbed into the chair beside him, leaning slightly against his arm. The book was simple, a story about a girl and a dog and a place far away from everything. James began to read, slow, steady, each word clear, each sentence measured like it mattered. Because to her, it did. Time passed quietly. The rain softened outside. The city settled into night, and for a little while nothing else existed. No restaurant, no judgment, no card in his pocket, just a father and his daughter, and a moment that didn't need anything more. Later, after Maya had fallen asleep again, this time in her bed, James stood by the window. The rain had almost stopped. Only a few drops clung to the glass, sliding slowly downward. He reached into his pocket one more time, pulled out the card. This time, he turned it over fully, looked at the name again, Elizabeth Whitmore. He exhaled, then set it on the counter. Not hidden, not thrown away, just there, like a door, still closed, but no longer ignored. Across the city, in a high-rise apartment that overlooked everything James had walked away from, Elizabeth stood by her own window, but her view didn't feel as clear tonight. Her phone rested in her hand. The screen lit, dark, then lit again. She hadn't called, hadn't even tried, because she didn't know what she would say. And for someone like her, that was rare. She set the phone down, walked away, then stopped, turned back, because something in her refused to let it go. Back in the Bronx, James turned off the light. The apartment fell into darkness, quiet, still. He lay down on the couch this time, one arm resting across his chest, eyes open for a moment longer. Thinking, not about the restaurant, not about the people, but about the way someone had looked at him and didn't turn away. He closed his eyes. Sleep came slowly, but it came, and somewhere between the noise of the city and the silence of the night, something had already begun to change. Neither of them had moved yet. Not really. But they would, because moments like that, they don't disappear, they wait. And when they return, they bring everything with them. Morning came quietly, the kind of quiet that only existed before the city fully woke up, before horns, before footsteps, before voices filled the spaces between buildings. In the Bronx, light crept slowly through thin curtains, brushing against worn walls and chipped paint. James was already awake. He stood in the kitchen, pouring coffee into the same chipped mug, the steam rising in soft curls that disappeared just as quickly as they formed. The card sat on the counter beside him, unmoved, unclaimed, but not forgotten. He didn't look at it, not yet. Instead, he leaned against the counter, staring out the small window above the sink. Across the street, a man was unlocking his shop. A woman walked past with a child bundled in a jacket too big for her. Life moving, simple and steady, That was enough. It had always been enough. "Daddy?" Maya's voice came from the bedroom. James set the mug down and turned. "In here," he said. She shuffled out, rubbing her eyes, hair still tangled from sleep. She paused when she saw him, then smiled. "You didn't wake me up," she said. "You needed the sleep." "I always need the sleep," she replied. "That's true." She walked over and climbed into the chair at the table, pulling her knees up as she watched him. "You working today?" she asked. "Yeah, same stuff, same stuff." She nodded, accepting that. Then her eyes drifted toward the counter. Toward the card. "Who's that?" she asked. James followed her gaze. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he walked over, picked it up, and turned it between his fingers. "Just someone I met," he said. "Is she nice?" He thought about it, the way she sat down without asking anyone else, the way she listened, the way she didn't turn away. "Yeah," he said finally. "She is," Maya smiled. "You should call her." James let out a quiet breath. Maybe, but his tone said something else. Not yet. Across the city, in a building that touched the sky, Elizabeth Whitmore didn't sleep much either. Her office looked the same as always. Glass walls, clean lines, everything in its place. But she wasn't looking at the skyline this morning. She was looking at a file. A thin one, new. On the front, a single name had been printed in clean black letters, James Carter. Her assistant stood nearby, unsure. "You asked for a background check," he said carefully. "That's everything we could find." Elizabeth didn't respond right away. She opened the folder. Inside, the first page was simple, basic information, address, work history, fragmented, inconsistent. Small jobs, temporary contracts. Nothing that explained what she had seen. She flipped the page. The next one changed everything. Her eyes paused, then narrowed slightly. "Is this accurate?" she asked. Her assistant stepped forward. "We verified it twice." Elizabeth read it again. James Carter, former U.S. Navy SEAL, decorated, multiple commendations, classified operations. Her fingers tightened slightly on the paper. "That's not possible," she murmured. "It is," the assistant said quietly. She flipped again. More details. A mission overseas. A rescue operation that had gone wrong. A report, partially redacted, describing actions taken under pressure that had saved lives. Her breath slowed. The man who sat quietly at a table no one wanted him at had once stood in places no one else could survive, and no one in that restaurant had known. She turned another page. This one was different. Medical records, hospital visits, bills. Her eyes scanned quickly, then stopped. Her chest tightened. "Wait," she said. The assistant leaned in. "What is it?" Elizabeth didn't answer. She was reading a name, a date, a diagnosis, and suddenly, the story shifted. In the Bronx, James walked Maya to school. The streets were busier now, cars moving, people talking, the city finding its rhythm again. Maya held his hand the whole way. "Are you picking me up today?" she asked. "Always. Even if you're busy, I'll make time." She nodded. That was enough for her. At the school gate, she hugged him quickly. "Don't forget to call that lady," she said. James smiled faintly. "We'll see." She ran off, disappearing into the building with the same energy she always had. James watched until she was gone, then turned and walked back into his day. Miles away, Elizabeth stood frozen in her office, the file still open in her hands, the page still staring back at her, because now she understood something she hadn't before. It wasn't just who James was, it was what had happened to him. The medical records told a story no one had said out loud. A wife, a long illness, treatments delayed, coverage denied, costs too high, choices no one should have to make. Her grip tightened, because one detail stood out above everything else: the hospital, the provider, the system. It was hers, not directly, but close enough, a subsidiary, a division, A decision made in a boardroom years ago that had seemed small at the time. Cost reduction, efficiency, risk management, words that sounded clean, reasonable, necessary, but now they had a face, a name, a life that had been changed because of them. Elizabeth closed the file slowly. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass. For the first time in a long time, she didn't like what she saw. Later that afternoon, James stood outside a small apartment building, tools in hand. A woman opened the door, relief on her face. "Thank you for coming," she said. "The pipe's been leaking all morning." "No problem," James replied. He stepped inside, already focused, already moving. Work was simple. Fix what's broken, do what you can. Leave things better than you found them. No questions, no expectations, just action. Across the city, Elizabeth made a decision. She picked up her phone, not hesitating this time, not questioning. She dialed. The line rang once, twice, 3 times, then connected. James wiped his hands on a rag, stepping back from the sink he had just fixed. Water flowed clean now, steady. The woman smiled. "You're a lifesaver." He shook his head. "Just doing my job." His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it, focused on packing up his tools. The phone buzzed again, persistent. He paused, then reached for it. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, almost. Then something stopped him. He tapped the screen. "Hello?" Silence, just for a second. Then, "James," her voice. Clear, recognizable, different outside the restaurant. More real, more uncertain. James didn't say anything right away. He stepped outside, away from the noise. "Elizabeth," he said finally. "Yes," another pause. Then she spoke again. "I think we need to talk." James looked down the street, at the city moving around him, at the life he knew, then back at nothing in particular. "About what?" he asked. Elizabeth took a breath. "About the truth," but she didn't say that. "Not yet. About something I should have known before I sat down at your table," she said instead. James's expression didn't change, but something inside him shifted. Because whatever this was, it wasn't small, and he could feel it. Right there, in the space between one moment and the next. The city didn't stop moving. Cars passed, people walked. Somewhere down the street, a siren echoed briefly before fading into the distance. Life carried on, indifferent to whatever was unfolding between two people standing on opposite sides of a phone call. James leaned against the brick wall outside the building, the rough surface pressing through his jacket. His tools sat by his feet, forgotten for the moment. "About something I should have known before I sat down at your table," Elizabeth had said. He let that settle. "Sounds like you found some," he replied. On the other end, Elizabeth stood in her office, the skyline behind her no longer feeling like power, but distance. The file was still open on her desk, the pages slightly shifted, like they had been handled too many times in too short a span. "I did," she said. Her voice was different now, less certain, more careful. James noticed. "You want to tell me what it is?" he asked. Another pause. Not hesitation. Decision, yes, she said finally. But not like this. James frowned slightly, glancing down the street again, then how in person? "That's not necessary. It is to me." There it was again, that quiet insistence. Not demanding, not forceful, just steady. James exhaled slowly. He had spent years learning how to recognize pressure. This wasn't it, but it was something. "Why?" he asked. Elizabeth looked down at the file again, at the name, at the dates, at the quiet trail of decisions that had led to a life unraveling. "Because what I have to say," she said, her voice softer now, "doesn't belong over a phone call." That landed heavier than anything else. James closed his eyes for a second, then opened them. "When?" he asked. Elizabeth didn't miss the shift. "Tonight," she said quickly, "if you're available." James almost laughed, not because it was funny, because of how easy she made it sound, like time was something that could be rearranged at will. "I've got a kid," he said, "and a job, I understand." "Do you?" Another pause, then, "No," she admitted, "but I'd like to." James rubbed the back of his neck, eyes drifting to the ground. The truth was, he could say no. Walk away, let whatever this was stay where it belonged, in her world, not his. But something about the way she said it didn't feel like it was about her world anymore. "Same place?" he asked. Elizabeth blinked. "You'd go back there?" James looked up. "Doesn't matter where," he said. "It's just a place." That answer stayed with her, because for him, it really was. "All right," she said. "Same place. 7. I'll see." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. The line went quiet. Neither of them hung up right away. Then, click, James slipped the phone back into his pocket. He stood there for a moment longer, thinking, not about what she might say, but about why it mattered enough for her to say it at all. Then he picked up his tools, knocked once on the door behind him. "I'm done," he called. The woman opened it, smiling. That was fast. It was simple. She handed him a few folded bills. "Thank you again." James took it. "Take care of it," he said. "That pipe won't last forever." "Nothing does," she replied. He gave a small nod, then turned and walked away. Across the city, Elizabeth hadn't moved. The phone was still in her hand, the conversation still echoing. Tonight. 7. Same place. She looked at the file again, at the page she hadn't been able to stop reading. Her chest tightened, because she knew what it meant, what it implied, and what it would do when she said it out loud. Later that evening, the sky turned a deeper shade of gray. Clouds hung low over Manhattan, threatening rain that hadn't decided whether to fall yet. The steakhouse lights came on again, warm and inviting, like nothing had changed, like it never would. Inside, the staff moved with the same rhythm, but underneath it, there was tension, because word had spread, not officially, not in any formal way, but people talked. And the story had already started to shift. The manager stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching, waiting, because tonight, he knew something was coming. He just didn't know what. At exactly 7, the door opened. James stepped inside. Same jacket, same quiet presence. But something about him felt different. Not stronger, not louder, just decided. The hostess looked up, recognition again, but this time, something else. Uncertainty. "Tell for one?" she asked. James met her eyes, for now. That answer lingered. She hesitated, then nodded. "Right this way." A few minutes later, the door opened again. Elizabeth walked in, and this time, everyone noticed. Because whatever was about to happen, it wasn't going to stay quiet. James sat at the same table, the same chair, the same place no one wanted. But tonight, it didn't feel the same. Because this time, he wasn't the only one who knew something was about to change. And neither was she. Elizabeth walked toward him without hesitation. No pause, no second thoughts, because the truth didn't wait. It didn't soften, it didn't ask permission. It simply arrived. And when it did, it changed everything. She reached the table, stopped, looked at him, and for the first time, there was no distance left between them. "Thank you for coming," she said. James leaned back slightly. "You said it mattered. It does." He nodded once, then say it. No small talk, no delay. Just the moment. Elizabeth took a breath, and for the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not doubt, something deeper, something heavier, responsibility. "Before I say anything else," she began, "you need to know. I didn't know who you were when I sat down." James didn't react. "I still don't know everything," she continued. "But I know enough now, a beat. Then, I know about your wife. That changed it. Not visibly, not immediately. But something in the air shifted. James's eyes held steady, but his hand tightened slightly on the edge of the table. "Go on," he said. Elizabeth swallowed, because this was the part that mattered, the part that couldn't be undone once it was spoken. "I know she was sick," she said, "and I know the treatment she needed wasn't approved." James didn't blink, didn't move, just listened. "And I know," she continued, her voice quieter now, "that the company responsible for that decision—" She stopped, just for a second, because saying it meant owning it, fully, completely, was connected to mine. Silence, the kind that fades, the kind that settles, heavy, unavoidable. The room around them disappeared, the noise, the people, the movement, all gone. Because in that moment, there was only truth and what came with it. James didn't speak, didn't look away. He just sat there, holding it, feeling it, letting it land. And whatever came next, there was no going back from it. The words didn't echo, they didn't need to, they just sat there, between them, on the table, in the air, heavy enough to quiet everything else in the room. Elizabeth didn't move, James didn't either. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Around the restaurant continued, but softer now, like the world itself had stepped back, waiting. Shaz finally leaned back slightly in his chair. Not defensive, not aggressive, just creating space. "You're saying," he said slowly, "that your company had something to do with what happened to my wife?" Elizabeth nodded once. "Yes, no excuse, no explanation yet, just the truth." James looked down at the table. His fingers rested near the edge again, the same way they had the night before. Still, controlled, but not untouched. "You didn't know," he said. "It wasn't a question." Elizabeth swallowed. "I didn't," she answered. "Not then. And now I do." Another pause. James let out a breath through his nose, slow and steady. People at nearby tables were pretending not to watch now. But they were. Of course they were. Because something about this moment felt different, more serious than anything that had happened here before. "You ever sit in a hospital waiting room?" James asked. Elizabeth blinked, caught off guard. "No," she admitted. James nodded, like that confirmed something he already knew. "They don't tell you everything right away," he said. "Not the way it really is." He leaned forward slightly now, elbows resting on the table. "They use words," he continued, "careful ones. Words that sound like hope, or options, or time." Elizabeth didn't interrupt. She didn't look away. She listened. "Then the bills start coming," James said. "And suddenly those words don't mean the same thing anymore." His voice never rose, never sharpened, but it carried something heavier than anger. "Memory. She needed treatment," he went on. "Not experimental, not risky, just something that could have helped." Elizabeth felt her chest tighten. She had read the file. But hearing it like this, from him, was different. "They said it wasn't covered," James said. "Said it didn't meet criteria. Said we could appeal." He gave a small, humorless exhale. "Appeal takes time," he added. "Time we didn't have." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of everything he didn't say. Everything he didn't need to. Elizabeth lowered her eyes. For the first time since she had sat down at his table, she didn't feel in control. "I can't change what happened," she said quietly. James looked at her. No, he agreed. "You can't. No blame, no accusation, just fact. But I can take responsibility for it," she added. That made him pause, because that wasn't something he had expected. "Responsibility?" he repeated. Elizabeth nodded. "My company made decisions," she said. "Decisions I signed off on without seeing the full impact, without understanding what they meant for people like your wife." She met his eyes again. "For people like you." James held her gaze. "And what does responsibility look like?" he asked. That was the question, the one that mattered, Not words, not apologies, action. Elizabeth didn't answer right away because she knew whatever she said next would define everything that followed. I don't know yet, she admitted. That surprised him. But I know it starts with this, she continued. With telling you the truth, and not pretending it doesn't matter. James leaned back again, studying her. You think that's enough? He asked. No, good. Another pause. Then James nodded slightly. Most people stop at, I'm sorry, he said. I'm not most people. He almost smiled at that. Almost. The server approached cautiously, glancing between them. Can I get you anything? He asked. James shook his head. Elizabeth didn't answer. The server nodded quickly and stepped away. I spent a long time being angry, James said. Elizabeth didn't move. Not loud, he added. Not the kind people see. Just there. He tapped his chest lightly. Right here. She listened. I kept thinking, he went on. If I had done something different, worked more, pushed harder, he stopped. Because that part never made sense out loud. Then he looked at her. But the truth is, he said, it wasn't something I could fix. Elizabeth felt that, because now she knew it was something she could have and hadn't. I can't give you back what you lost, she said. James nodded. I know, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again. That shifted something, small, but real. James looked at her more carefully now. Not as a stranger, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had stepped into something deeper than either of them planned. That's a big promise, he said. I don't make small ones. He believed that, not because of who she was, but because of how she said it. Across the room, the manager stood frozen again, watching, trying to understand what he was seeing, because this wasn't how things were supposed to work. People like James weren't supposed to sit at tables like that. People like Elizabeth weren't supposed to stay. And conversations like this, they weren't supposed to happen in places like this. Back at the table, James reached for his glass, took a slow sip, then set it down again. You didn't have to tell me, he said. Elizabeth shook her head. Yes, I did. Why? She didn't hesitate this time, because you deserved to know who was sitting across from you. That landed, because it wasn't about power, or money, or status. It was about truth. James nodded slowly, then pushed his chair back, not to leave, not yet, just to shift, to breathe. You know what's strange? He said. What? I'm not angry at you. Elizabeth blinked. Not directly, he added. I don't know you well enough for that. A small pause, but I am angry at what you represent. She accepted that. Without defense, without argument. Then let me change what that is, she said. James looked at her, long, carefully, because people said things like that all the time. But very few meant them, and even fewer followed through. You really think you can? He asked. Elizabeth didn't look away. I have to, not for him, not for herself, but because now she couldn't unsee it. The moment stretched, balanced between what had been and what could be. James finally nodded. Not agreement, not trust, just acknowledgement. All right, he said. Elizabeth exhaled quietly, because that was more than she expected, more than she deserved. Outside, the city moved on, unchanged, unaware. But inside that small corner of a restaurant, something had shifted. Not loud, not visible, but real. Because for the first time, the truth had been spoken, and neither of them had walked away, not yet. The restaurant no longer felt like the place built for comfort. Not for them, not anymore. The polished wood, the dim amber light, the quiet conversations. It all seemed distant now, like a backdrop that had lost its purpose. What mattered sat between them, unspoken but understood. James rested his hands on the table, fingers loosely interlocked. He wasn't angry. That was the part Elizabeth couldn't fully grasp. He had every reason to be, every right, and yet, he wasn't. What happens now? He asked, not accusing, not demanding, just asking. Elizabeth leaned forward slightly, her voice steady, but softer than it had been all night. That depends on you. James raised an eyebrow. On me? Yes. He let out a quiet breath. That's not how this usually works. No, she agreed. It's not. A pause stretched between them. Then James shook his head slowly. You've got money, he said. Influence. People who listen when you speak. Elizabeth didn't deny it. And you think I'm going to tell you what to do with it? He continued. I think you're the only one who can tell me what it should mean, she replied. That stopped him, because it wasn't about control. It wasn't about fixing things the way people like her usually did. Fast, visible, transactional, was something else, something harder. You want to know what it should mean? James said quietly. He leaned back, eyes drifting for a moment. Not to the room, not to the people watching, but somewhere else entirely, somewhere older. You ever sit across from someone you love, he said slowly, and realize you can't do anything to help them? Elizabeth didn't answer. She didn't have to. That's what it should mean, he continued, making sure no one else has to sit there and feel that. The words settled deep, deeper than anything she had read in a report or heard in a meeting, because this wasn't data, this was reality, raw, unfiltered. And how do we do that? She asked. James looked back at her. We? She nodded. If you're serious, she said, then yes. We. He studied her for a long moment, trying to decide, not if she meant it, but if it mattered. Because meaning it wasn't enough. It never had been. You don't fix this with donations, he said. Or headlines, I know. You don't fix it by writing a check and walking away. I know that too. Another pause, then James leaned forward again. You fix it by changing how the system works, he said. Who gets approved? Who gets denied? Who gets seen? Elizabeth nodded slowly. That's not easy. No, he said. It's not. People will push back. They always do. It'll cost more. Everything that matters does. The conversation wasn't heated. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. And that made it heavier than anything else in the room. Across the restaurant, the man in the navy suit had gone quiet. He wasn't whispering anymore. He wasn't watching with judgment. He was just listening. Because something about this moment didn't fit the world he understood. And that made it impossible to ignore. Elizabeth straightened slightly. If I do this, she said, I'm not doing it halfway. James nodded once. I figured. And I'm not doing it alone. That caught him. What does that mean? It means I don't want advisors who've never lived it, she said. I don't want executives guessing what people need. She met his eyes. I want someone who knows. James leaned back again, processing that. You're asking me to help you, he said. I'm asking you to make sure I don't get it wrong. He let out a quiet breath. That's a lot. I know. I've got a kid, he said. A life, bills, responsibilities. I'm not asking you to leave any of that behind. Then what are you asking? Elizabeth didn't hesitate. I'm asking you to stand where you already are, she said, and help me see what I've been missing. The simplicity of it surprised him, because it wasn't a job offer. It wasn't a rescue. It was respect. James looked down at the table again, at the empty plate, at the glass of water he hadn't touched in a while, at the place where everything had started. He thought about Maya, about her small hand in his, about the questions she asked, about the future he was trying to build without knowing if it would hold. Then he thought about everything Elizabeth had said, and everything she hadn't. You really think people like me get a say in things like that? He asked. Elizabeth's answer came without hesitation. They should. That's not the same thing. No, she said. It's not. Another pause. Then, I can't promise you anything, James said. I'm not asking for a promise. I don't trust systems like yours. You shouldn't. And I don't trust people who run them. Elizabeth nodded. Fair. He looked at her again. Long, carefully. But I believe you when you say you want to change something, he added. That was the closest thing to trust she was going to get, and she knew it. That's enough, she said. The moment shifted again. Not dramatically, but enough. Because something had been decided. Not fully, not completely, but enough to move forward. James stood. This time it wasn't to leave the conversation, it was to end the night. I've got to get home, he said. Elizabeth stood too. Of course. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the folded bills again. Elizabeth shook her head. You don't have to. I do, he said, placing them on the table. That part doesn't change. She didn't argue, because she understood now. It wasn't about the money. It was about who he was. As he turned to go, she spoke again. James, he paused. If you're willing, she said, I'd like to meet again. Not here. Somewhere that makes more sense. He considered that, then nodded once. All right, no details, no schedule, just agreement. He walked toward the door, same steady pace, same quiet presence, but this time he wasn't invisible. People moved slightly as he passed, not out of discomfort, but out of awareness. Because now, they knew something they hadn't before, or at least they felt it. Outside, the air was colder again, the city louder, but James didn't slow down. He had somewhere to be, someone waiting, and something new, something uncertain, waiting just beyond that. Inside, Elizabeth remained standing, watching the door, thinking, not about what she had just started, but about what it would take to finish it. Because for the first time in her life, success didn't feel like enough, and that was the beginning of everything changing. Weeks passed, not quickly, not in a way that erased what had happened, but in a way that allowed something new to take root. The city moved as it always did, fast, loud, relentless. But for James Carter, something beneath that rhythm had shifted, not in his routine. He still woke early, still made coffee in the chipped mug, still walked Maya to school, her hand slipping into his like it had always belonged there. Still took on whatever work came his way, fixing pipes, carrying boxes, helping where he could. From the outside, nothing had changed. But that wasn't the truth, because change doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it builds quietly, in conversations, in decisions, in moments no one else sees. Elizabeth Whitmore had not walked away. She had done exactly what she said she would do, not with headlines, not with grand gestures, but with work, real work, the kind that didn't show up on magazine covers or investor reports. She called meetings, not the usual kind, different ones, smaller rooms, different voices, people who had never been invited before, people who understood the cost of being overlooked. James didn't step into her world all at once. He didn't leave his behind either. He stayed where he was, just like he said he would. But now, he spoke, and she listened, not as a CEO, not as someone in charge, but as someone who needed to learn. It wasn't easy. Change never was. There was pushback, questions, resistance, executives who didn't understand why things needed to shift, board members who saw risk where Elizabeth saw responsibility. But she didn't stop, because now, it wasn't theoretical, it wasn't abstract. It had a name, a face, a story she couldn't unsee. One afternoon, James stood in a community center that smelled faintly of fresh paint and old wood. A small group of people sat in folding chairs, listening, not to a speech, not to a presentation, to a conversation. James spoke slowly, clearly, the same way he always did. People don't need more forms, he said. They need someone to see them before it's too late. Elizabeth stood near the back of the room, not at the front, not above anyone, just present, listening, learning. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one leading. She was the one following. That night, something else happened. Something quieter, but just as important. The same steakhouse stood under the same lights, the same polished wood, the same soft glow, but the air felt different, because people remembered, not everything, but enough. The story had spread, not through headlines, not through news, but through something older. Word of mouth, curiosity, respect. The door opened. James stepped inside. This time he wasn't alone. Maya walked beside him, her small hand wrapped around his fingers, her eyes wide as she looked around. "Whoa," she whispered. "This place is fancy." James smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said. "It is." The hostess looked up. For the moment, recognition flickered. Then something else replaced it. Respect. "Good evening," she said, her tone different now. "Table for two?" James nodded. For two, she didn't hesitate this time. Didn't glance toward the manager. Didn't guide them toward the back. Instead, she led them forward. Toward the center, toward a table by the window, the kind of table people usually waited for. Maya looked up at him. "Are we allowed to sit here?" she whispered. James looked down at her, then at the table, then back at her. "Yeah," he said softly, "we are." They sat, not as guests who didn't belong, not as exceptions, but as people who had earned their place without asking for it. A few minutes later, the door opened again. Elizabeth stepped inside. No hesitation, no pause. She walked toward them, a small smile forming as she saw Maya. "You must be Maya," she said gently. Maya nodded, curious. "That's me." Elizabeth extended her hand. "I've heard a lot about you." Maya looked at her dad. James gave a small nod. "It's okay." Maya shook her hand. "You're the lady from the card," she said. Elizabeth smiled. "I am. You're nice," Maya added. Elizabeth laughed softly. "I'm trying to be." They sat together, not as a billionaire and a stranger, not as two people from different worlds, but as three people sharing a table, a meal, a moment. Around them, the restaurant moved as it always had. But something was different, subtle, but real, because now, when people looked at James Carter, they didn't see what they expected to see. They saw something else, something they hadn't noticed before, and maybe something they hadn't understood. Maya laughed at something James said, her voice light, filling the space between them. Elizabeth watched, not as an observer, but as part of it, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt right. Later, as the meal came to an end, James leaned back slightly, looking out the window at the city beyond. Lights stretched endlessly, possibilities he had never considered before, not because they weren't there, but because no one had ever shown him where to look. Elizabeth followed his gaze. "Funny," she said quietly. "What is?" James asked. "This place," she replied. "It hasn't changed at all." James nodded. "No," he said. "It hasn't." A small pause. Then he added, "But we did." The moment settled. Warm, complete, not perfect, but real. As they stood to leave, Maya slipped her hand back into James's, the same way she always did. Only now, the world around them felt different, not because it had changed overnight, but because someone had finally chosen to see it differently. At the door, James paused. He looked back once, at the table, at the space where everything had started, then forward again. Because that's where life moved. That's where it always had. Outside, the city waited, loud, bright, full of stories no one had told yet. James stepped into it, not as someone trying to belong, but as someone who already did. And somewhere, in the space between what was and what could be, a simple truth remained. Kindness doesn't always change the world in a moment, but it changes the people who carry it, and those people, they change everything. When James Carter walked back into that same restaurant, and finally sat at the table by the window with his daughter. It wasn't the seat that had changed. It was the way the world finally chose to see him. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to fight back. It's to keep showing up with dignity when the world keeps getting it wrong. Because real change doesn't start with money or power. It starts the moment someone decides to listen, like Elizabeth did. So the next time you cross paths with someone like James, quiet, overlooked, carrying more than you can see, don't just walk past. Look again. That one moment of attention might be the moment that changes everything. If this story touched you, comment 1 below. If you've ever felt unseen like James, comment 0. And tell me, have you ever met someone who changed your life without even trying? There's another story coming next. And this one might hit even closer to home.